Thank you for being here. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the President of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Before we plunge into tonight's program, I want to give you a couple of quick words on some upcoming events at the Council. So the next up for us will be February 12th, when we partner with the Museum of the American Revolution to present the first part of a new series, which we're calling World Affairs and the Enduring American Revolution. Please join us at the museum for a program called The Global Rise of Authoritarianism, which will include a special opportunity to view the museum's Hamilton exhibit, which is really quite something to see. And our keynote speaker will be Garry Kasparov, of course, the Russian chess grandmaster, chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, and a very important political activist, not only in the Russian context, but on the global scale. Then on March the 4th, we will be welcoming former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie to discuss his new book, Let Me Finish, Trump, the Kushners, Bannon, New Jersey, and the Power of In-Your-Face Politics. So a mouthful of a title, and I think we'll have a mouthful of an evening. So please come and join us. I want to thank Katya Mead, who's here in the front row, the National Outreach Director for the Iran Project, who's been instrumental in helping us put together tonight's distinguished panel. So turning to the substance of this evening's discussion, I think everyone, or almost everyone in this room, is old enough to remember when the fear of nuclear weapons was the dominant issue of the time. And also old enough to remember the incredible relief the world felt when it seemed for that sort of Damocles hanging above our heads had been sheathed. Well, history moves in mysterious ways, or maybe not so mysterious. Maybe it was predictable all along. But we come today to a new era in which the reality of nuclear threats of one kind or another is undeniable, and many think that it's growing, with the famous Doomsday clock once again seeming to click. Together this evening, two extraordinarily gifted experts on these matters, and we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion, a global in sweep about the issues related to nuclear weapons in the 21st century. The Honorable Thomas Pickering is Distinguished Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, capping an extraordinary career as an American diplomat. Ambassador Pickering served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 1997 to 2000. Suzanne DiMaggio is a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and is a leading scholar, commentator, and consultant on these matters. Our guests, we asked our guests if they wanted to make some opening remarks tonight. They declined. They said they wanted to get right into conversation and questions and have the maximum amount of time left for interaction with all of you. So that's what we're going to do. So please join me in welcoming our guests. Okay, I think we're all on. Okay, so I want to start by asking about what we now hear is the planned second summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un on North Korea. If you could tell us what you think about this upcoming summit, and in the context of what you think about this situation between the United States and North Korea on the issue of nuclear weapons. Please.
So first, let me thank all of you for coming this evening and thank the World Affairs Council for hosting us. We are really happy to be in Philadelphia. It's a great city and I'm happy to be back. On this question, we are now, it seems, preparing for a second summit between North Korea's Kim Jong-un and President Trump. The first summit happened in Singapore just in June, 7 months ago. Let me start with the positives. The big positive is we are no longer on the brink of war with North Korea. So you remember all the fire and fury of 2017, where there was a lot of threatening language. We saw a lot of mobilization of U.S. military assets brought into the region. We saw the North Koreans test for the first time what we believe is a thermonuclear device. That's great progress from their last test. We also saw them test 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles for the first time. And what was so momentous about that, they launched these missiles at loft trajectories, so straight up in the air. But once we were able to project how far those missiles traveled, guess what? They could hit Philadelphia, they could hit Washington, they could hit New York, they could hit anywhere on the continental United States. Now, experts say they may not have the full technical capacity to do that, but it's just a matter of time. So that's the good news. They haven't, since the summit, and well before that, they haven't tested a nuclear device, they haven't tested any missiles of any kind, and the rhetoric has come down, tensions have been reduced. The bad side is that since Singapore, we have seen virtually no progress between the United States and North Korea. We've seen a lot of progress between North and South Korea, but on our agenda items, if you look at the document that came out of the Singapore summit, denuclearization, we've made 0 progress. So that's a bit of a worry. I think the second downside is President Trump will be going into this summit what I would call a far weaker position than he was back in June. He's facing a number of domestic issues. His polling numbers are down over these past weeks since the government shutdown. The Moon report could be out by the time of the summit, maybe before or after, it's unclear. So that's another negative aspect of this. I think our leverage, our negotiating leverage, has subsided since the last summit. There are other downsides. We haven't taken advantage of opportunities that have been presented for diplomacy. I think we've missed opportunities to address not only the nuclear program, but chemical weapons, biological weapons, and other weapons of mass destruction. So I think it's a mixed bag, but overall, I was supportive of the first summit because I always think it's better to talk to your adversaries, especially those that have nuclear weapons, than not to talk. But I hope this opportunity isn't a fleeting opportunity. My biggest worry is that if we don't make any progress, the naysayers, some of whom are in this administration, might make the call that we've exhausted diplomacy, that we've come to the end of the line, and then we may see a reoccurrence of a call to more kinetic action, perhaps military strikes. And that is for me, not a winning situation. I cannot see us coming out of any military action with the North Koreans unscathed, and certainly our allies in the region would be targeted. So it's a mixed picture, but I still believe there's a chance to engage the North Korean regime. Kim Jong-un, I think, is turning his attention to economic modernization. That gives us leverage at the negotiating table, and that's leverage we should be using.
I agree with Suzanne, and I think she's covered it very well, and I join her in saying how pleased we are to be here tonight, and thank you all very much for having us and for coming. I think that picking up where Susan took us, I think it's important to recognize that the pressure against North Korea, organized by President Trump, was a helpful addition. We were all, however, a little bit unnerved by the fact that it was all pressure and no opportunity to devote that pressure to diplomatic negotiations. And in that sense, we got a hand, and the president got a hand from President Moon of South Korea, who provided the intermediaries to bring the news that Kim Jong-un was ready to meet. I think that meeting was better than not meeting. I agree fully. I think the difficult problem was that the goal was set so high as to be clearly unachievable, particularly in the time allowed. And the outcome was a kind of nothing burger, we call, a paper which didn't do anything but repeated objectives. And the president trumpeted that the idea of war is finished and that denuclearization is at hand, neither of which I think was true. Where are we? We did succeed both at the summit and the work leading up to the summit in freezing, as I think Suzanne made clear, both nuclear weapons testing and nuclear delivery vehicle missile testing. And that's a step forward. We paid, at least in some way, for that by cutting out at least the nuclear aspects of our joint exercises with the Republic of Korea in the military arena, and perhaps more. It's not entirely clear where that has gone. Where can we go next is very important. One would love to jump right away to the big enchilada and have Kim Jong-un to deliver all of his nuclear weapons in a Mercedes at the border with South Korea. That isn't going to happen, and it may never happen. But what we can begin to do is look more realistically at the possibilities, and they include perhaps an important step of shutting down the known areas that produce fissionable materials for nuclear weapons, which begins to put a limit on how many the North Koreans can assemble. Clearly, we believe plutonium is made at a place called Yongbyon, and next to it, uranium is enriched. We also have reason to believe, because they've shown it to us, they have another uranium enrichment facility, and I've always thought if they have shown us another one, they have one they haven't shown us, that we don't really know where either of those two are located. But this is a step in the right direction, but not a perfect step. And we will probably have to be helpful in getting this to take some of the sanctions off and perhaps doing other things. And some have suggested, we talked about this earlier today, finding a way to shut down as much as we can any capability North Korea has to help other countries proliferate nuclear weapons. And that too is an important objective. And so I think those things have to be out there and move. I would just say, in terms of the bigger picture, I think that Kim Jong-un is clearly dedicated to the prolongation for as long as possible of North Korea and his progeny's leadership of that organization. This requires the point that Suzanne made of economic support from in some form or other. And that, in some ways, is additional leverage. Whether that also includes, as I think it does, a political relationship around the world for North Korea is something that Kim Jong-un would desire. I think he does. And I think he counts highly, because he's been there 4 times recently, his relationship with China. And how that fits needs to be factored in. Whether this combination of leverages is sufficient to remove all the nuclear weapons from the DPRK is highly questionable, but not impossible, if I could put it that way. But I think the odds are against that happening. Even if we could reduce the number of weapons and the amount of additional material he produces to make weapons, this is an exercise well worth pursuing, and that we should do so. One of the problems is that the president doesn't take advice very well. And so we don't know if the next summit, as now appears rumored, is held by the end of February in Hanoi, Vietnam, what the outcome will be. There is as much chance as it will be a nothing burger communique as something really useful, like stopping some of the production of fissionable material in the DPRK. So there are opportunities. We have very good people who know what they are. Can they make the connection? Can the president move from something which he sees as a triumph of personal egotism to something that is a triumph of U.S. national interest? And up till now, the two haven't fit. And that's a real problem that we face. but this opportunity is there. I say finally, the president's done a number of things here that I think are correct, but I think the president is operating more like the old saying that even a broken clock is right twice a day.
So I want to stay on North Korea for just a bit. What I think I hear both of you saying is that presidents of both parties for a long time have been sort of fundamentally misleading the American people by saying that the possession of nuclear weapons, a nuclear capability of any kind on the part of North Korea is unacceptable, and that the United States would never accept it. That in reality, the North Koreans crossed that Rubicon. They're not likely to go back over it, at least not entirely, and that in some sense, the more important question at this point becomes not their capabilities, although we'd like to keep those capabilities from advancing, but not their possession of nuclear capability, but rather their intention, right? So the British, the French, the Indians, the Israelis, there are countries around the world that have lots of nuclear weapons. Nobody in the United States wakes up worried about those countries having nuclear weapons. Most people do. Is it possible to fashion a political relationship of the sort you're talking about because of the needs of the North Korean state that make it virtually unthinkable that they would actually use these weapons, and we just live with their deterrent capability?
I'm not ready to concede that point yet, because I don't think we have fully tested diplomacy. And until we do, I'm not ready to give up on that point. So yes, you're right. Past administrations have been dealing with this issue. We've attempted to reach agreements with the North Koreans, and they've all faltered, due in part to cheating on North Koreans. It's coming in and out.
Yeah, it's going.
I'll use yours if you don't mind. The North Koreans have cheated. We haven't delivered on our end of the bargain. So there's a lot of blame to go around. So what makes this moment different? And I think it's Kim Jong-un to some extent, and I also think it's the South Korean president, President Moon, who has really made this engagement and reconciliation between North and South the centerpiece of his administration. And in order for North and South to reconcile, the United States has to be on board too, for a number of reasons. So he's played a very big role. But let's talk about Kim Jong-un for a moment. Why would he even consider giving up his nuclear weapons? And this is why I'm not ready to give up on the idea. He's 35 years old, we believe, or around that. I think he just had a birthday. He is the third leader of the Kim dynasty now of North Korea. I don't know. I don't think that was. We're here. And I think we could all agree that his biggest concern is his preservation of his regime, the continuation of the Kim dynasty. So if you read what he's been saying over these past 2 years, he's basically been telegraphing what he intends to do. First was to advance the nuclear program to a point where he had nuclear devices and the way to deliver them to the United States directly. And he's accomplished that more or less. But he's also now said he's ready to change that strategic line to what he's calling everything for the economy. So this is what's different between him and his predecessors, his grandfather and father. And that's why I'm not ready to give up on the idea of any rollback on their nuclear program and nuclear capability. I think it's unrealistic to expect, as the United States has been doing, going into these negotiations, saying you have to give up your nuclear program before you get any significant concessions. That clearly isn't going to work. Then we switch to, you have to declare every nuclear weapon site, facility, every missile site, before we give you any concession. That clearly isn't going to work. It's really unrealistic to think he's going to move forward on these things unless and until he feels he has the security to preserve the Kim regime, and two, that there's a clear path to rapid and sustained economic modernization. So that's where we have the cards to play. So I think intention is a big part of it. And I think to give President Trump credit, which I don't do too often, so you might want to record this, this is where I think the approach is actually innovative, is probably too strong, novel. The leader-to-leader dynamic. I think for someone of Kim's psychology, it's the right way to engage him. It's very appealing to him. It's also appealing to our president as well. So in that sense, it's the right approach. And then focusing on changing the fundamental relationship, nature of our relationship is key to getting this done. Now, the problem is, yes, the intention there is a good one, but where we have failed is the inability to formulate a coherent strategy to move this ball forward. And here is where I'd be very tough on President Trump. I think he has set up a dangerous dynamic that has undercut diplomacy every step of the way. After Singapore, he declared North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat. Well, if you're a diplomat trying to denuclearize North Korea, that kind of knocks the wind out of you. And then he also said we're in no hurry. And by the way, Kim Jong-un and I are in love. So that doesn't necessarily help the process of diplomacy. So hopefully with this next summit, before we even get back to the table, there's a month to work out at least an interim agreement, precisely what Tom said. Can we reach an agreement where they decommission one of their facilities, the Yongbyon facility, and in exchange, we maybe do some limited sanctions exemption. We start talking about a declaration saying that the Korean War is over. Why can't we do that? That's different from a peace agreement. So declare the war is over and then present a path forward to getting to what that agreement means. A path towards normalization of relations, a path towards economic cooperation, exchange of diplomatic presence in each capital. We have a liaison office there, they have one in Washington. These are the sorts of things we should be pursuing. But right now, that isn't happening at the level or the pace that we need to get there. Certainly not by Hanoi in late February, but I think we need to start ramping that up. There was a meeting just the other day, a couple of days over this weekend, where our senior nuclear negotiator on this issue, Steve Biegun, met with his North Korean counterpart, someone I've met a number of times, Chae Sun-wi. That may be the start of a new phase of diplomacy. I certainly hope so. We'll have to see, but I think unless and until we see that intensive diplomacy, we're really not going to get anywhere.
Just additional remarks here. I think it's important to note that proceeding in stepwise fashion doesn't mean that you won't go all the way. Secondly, we don't negotiate with ourselves, and we do not change and should not change our objective of full denuclearization. We shouldn't fool ourselves that it has come prematurely. I think secondly, the management of the pressures that we have is very important. We don't want to give up our most important pressures until we get the most important objective. And the most important objective is to get the nuclear weapons out of North Korea. And our most important objectives are to do those things that Kim would like to see, that gives him a strong sense that he and his regime can survive. Now, this is difficult because this is still only a halfway house to reunification of the Korean Peninsula. We have always thought a denuclearized peninsula would be easier to unite than a nuclearized peninsula. And I think that remains true. But this management of leverage and the management of objectives and the management of the steps and stages requires the kind of diplomacy that has not yet been incorporated in the process. And that clearly is a major task for the next summit. If it is going to be able to work, people like Steve Biggin, who is the negotiator, going to have not just pictures taken with the president, but the president's authority to move ahead in a fashion that can, one way or another, begin to put together the stepwise agreements to get down the road in the direction in which we have to go.
Thank you. I think we're going to turn this one off and we'll just share the other one. Okay, so I want to move to Russia and the sort of nuclear weapons aspects of our relationship with Russia. Let me start with this. There's been some discussion in the sort of professional press about this issue to the effect that that the Russians have declared a nuclear first use doctrine, a so-called nuclear de-escalation, and that even as a matter of doctrine, before we get to the question of capabilities, as a matter of doctrine, they have become more threatening with respect to nuclear weapons in Europe. Agree, disagree?
No, I agree. And I think the Russian willingness to move away from no first use, something that I hasten to remind you is not U.S. policy either, is both a match, but also, I think, a disappointment for us, because being in a nuclear first use posture means that you will use nuclear weapons not only against a nuclear attack, because that would be the first use, but against non-nuclear objectives, which in many ways then gets us involved in a nuclear exchange under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction and makes that more likely. I think that we are in a position where we have come at the height of Cold War from 70,000 nuclear weapons on both sides to something around 12 or 13, 7 Russian, 5 US or less. We have come to agree that there will only be 1,550 deliverable nuclear weapons on both sides, still way above what we would need to create the kind of havoc in the other country that would in many ways, put it this way, extinguish life or clearly threaten the planet's survival. Recent efforts to promote that downward have been resisted by Mr. Putin for years. But now we have joined the crowd, and we have taken a nuclear treaty that has eliminated, on the Russian side, 1,200 missiles between 500 and 5,000 miles range, intermediate range missiles, and 350 on the US side when it was signed in the late 1980s under Mr. Gorbachev and President Reagan. And we have said, because we have accused the Russians of violating that treaty with a new cruise missile, and they have accused us of 3 violations. The Russians are never far behind. And one of those is that missile defense facilities in Romania, which we have put up in recent years, can also fire offensive missiles to Russia of a very short range, so a very short time. And that was the reason for doing away with the intermediate missiles, because stationed in Europe, they could be in each other's capitals in 6 to 7 minutes. And that was a very destabilizing question, because it meant people had to make decisions about going after the other side. And we have had at least 3 known documented instances where each side has misperceived what the other side was doing and came close to launching all of its missiles on the basis of a misperception. That means we are in a situation of increasing rather than increasing stability. And stability is our friend in mutually assured destruction. And it is in many ways something that we need to build more time for leaders to make decisions. I could not think of anything worse than awaking the president in the morning before he starts tweeting and telling him that we now have 200 Russian nuclear missiles on the way to the United States and what should you do? I would like to have a minimum of 24 hours. And we could have that instead of tearing up nuclear agreements, if we made an agreement which we could monitor that each side would take its warheads off its missiles and store them in a way that we could see them putting them back so that we would know that there would be a violation coming up, but we could each have the time, if they stayed that way, to look at the question of whether an attack was coming really and how and in what way we could prevent a catastrophe which would be planetary. Now, this rush now on the US side has been complimented in a bit because President Putin has said within the last 3 days that he would invite the United States to come and inspect this missile that he's produced and verify from his perspective that it doesn't have a range over 500 miles. And we have said, no, sorry, we're convinced that the missile is a violator, and all you can do to solve this problem is destroy all those missiles. They have at least 3 battalions of these missiles already deployed. On their side, they said to us, you can fix the launcher for defense against missile attack in a way that it cannot launch offensive missiles. And this is their suggestion for dealing with what they claim to be a violation on our side. There are other things here too, but they're easy to solve. At the moment, the US side says no, and we are committed to get rid of this agreement. That would leave us with only one nuclear limitation agreement in place, something called New START, which sets the 1,550 limitations. And we have to, by the agreement itself in 2021, agree to extend it for another 5 years or it lapses. With all of these agreements lapsing, we're back in a place where each side is free to pursue however it wants a build-up race. And the US has already committed almost $1 trillion over the long term to modernize our nuclear weapons. And Russia is following suit. So we are soon going to be in what is essentially a race to make what already is probably more than sufficient to destroy us 3 times more powerful. And that does not seem to be a wise choice of what we should be doing. We have an opportunity to sit down. And while Russia has resisted this for some time, now we are resisting it. And it seems to me we're off on the wrong side. And each president in their public remarks has over the last couple of months talked about nuclear weapons as if they're truly usable. And if they're sort of just hand grenades with a larger charge, something that clearly is a false perception. One of the great events, I think, was that when Gorbachev and Reagan sat down and agreed that nuclear war was not winnable and it was unfathomable. It should never even be postulated as a useful opportunity for any state, and that they would work against it. This was a period when we had, I think, the beginning of a clear recognition of what we were up against. And so further reductions and maybe elimination is possible. Elimination, in my view, is not a pipe dream, but neither is it a slam dunk. But people like Kissinger and Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, George Shultz, and Sam Nunn, all told us 8 or 10 years ago in a very important op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that we had to consider that option. And I fully support considering the option. I don't know yet whether, in fact, that consideration would ever take us there, but it is worth spending some time on.
So let's stay with the issues that you've raised about Russia and the relationship with Russia. In addition to the doctrine question, it's been reported that the Russians have developed battlefield, what used to be called battlefield nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, reduced blast effect, enhanced radiation effect, and are in fact looking at them, as you've said, as potentially usable weapons. Also, we have the reality of President Putin's well-publicized press conference. I guess it was about a year and a half ago, in which he talked about the hypersonic cruise missiles, weapons that were invulnerable, invincible, and depicted them attacking Florida graphically. So I guess, is there an argument to be made that the response of the administration, the Trump administration, in talking about enhanced ballistic missile defense, talking about enhanced modernization of American forces, and in talking about withdrawing from the INF agreement, are a necessary response to restore deterrence?
Let me, if I can, just say a few words about it. No one that I know of has said that the nuclear stockpile is turning into green cheese. And we have spent over the years quite large sums of money to assure that the nuclear stockpile will be maintained. And the Obama and the Trump administration have both consecrated a significant amount of money to do that. And I don't in any way belittle that. I just think a great large advance with many new types of weapons isn't going to help. Now, you were right, but the Russians developed tactical nuclear weapons 35 years ago, as we did. And the Russians have always resisted including tactical nuclear weapons in strategic disarmament. And in large measure, the Russians have a peculiar problem. They have a 7,000-mile border with China. They are very worried that on one side of the border, all the way from the center of Siberia to the Pacific coast, there are less than 8 million people. On the other side of the border, all the way, there's something like 200 million people within walking distance. And the river that is the border in most places freezes in the winter. So in effect, the Russians have a serious problem with China. And in no way should that be discounted. And the Russians have made it clear that tactical nuclear weapons are their answer to a Chinese invasion. I'm not sure necessarily that's 100% the right way to proceed, but it is there. In a period under George H.W. Bush, we withdrew our tactical nuclear weapons from Europe in the main. We still have some deliverable by NATO allies, but they're of the strategic sort. And we always thought maybe the deal would be no Western weapons of a tactical sort in Europe and no Russian weapons west of the Urals as a way to deal with this problem. And maybe they could then be incorporated in overall totals so that both in location and numbers, they would be calculated in the total nuclear armament of both sides and hopefully begin to be reduced where that was useful and important. And that's something that still needs to be looked at as a way to proceed. But in a period where we're spending most of our time tearing up things, bringing about new agreements is pretty far from the possibility. And missing the opportunity to engage the Russians on preserving INF, even if we distrust Putin in many things, is in my view a lost opportunity we shouldn't let go by.
I have to agree profusely with Tom. I do think with this administration, in particular a person by the name of John Bolton, who's our national security advisor, has a real allergy to agreements and treaties, arms control treaties. And I agree that, yes, there are problems with the INF. Should we withdraw to make a point? I don't think so. These agreements are hard won. And any arms control agreement worth its weight, it's not unusual to have to revisit it, come back to the table. This offer that Tom mentioned, that the Russians put forward now for us to come actually observe and inspect and look at the missile in question, we should take that. Why are we so ready and willing to withdraw from a treaty that's worked for decades? And the further point is the idea of negotiating a new treaty on anything seems very distant to me. So all the more reason to stick with it. But this bigger picture of the United States withdrawing from agreements, not only in the field of nuclear. We're going to talk about, I think, the Iran deal soon, but also in the area of trade, TPP, the Paris Climate Accord. I'm speaking about agreements, but commitments as well. With a single tweet, we learn about this a lot of times. And then we also learn later that there hasn't been a really in-depth interagency policy process to vet these policy changes. So they're being made on a whim. And on this issue, I think when it comes to nuclear, it's especially worrying. I remember a little while ago, maybe it was last year sometime, President Trump reportedly was having a conversation with someone about nuclear weapons and said, well, what good are they? We're not prepared to use them. That to me is one of the most frightening things I've ever heard. And I think the notion that we should even be considering their use in such a cavalier way should demand our attention and really push back against that as hard as we can. The idea of using nuclear weapons in any situation, we've fallen very far from the time when our leaders would say, no, the notion of using nuclear weapons is not a possibility to where we are today. And I think we need to move back to where we were.
Okay, one more question about the INF, which I think your comments, Ambassador, about the relationship between Russia and China, sort of a precursor to my question. It may well be that the Russian policy around tactical nuclear weapons is really aimed at China rather than the West. Similarly, some people argue that the whole issue of the INF is not really about Russia, but is about China. The fact that the Chinese are not parties to the treaty, they're not limited in that way, and they may well have a very significant short-range ballistic missile capability that threatens to give them hegemony in the South Pacific by making by really destroying the credibility of an American security guarantee in Taiwan and elsewhere. And in other words, that the United States either needs to somehow bring the Chinese into that regime, which is difficult to see how they would agree to because this is a key element of power for them, or we have to be able to match them. We can't match them under the existing treaty. So can we sort of turn from Russia to China and that aspect?
Yeah, it's an important and interesting question, Craig, and I think it's important to consider two aspects of it. One is the South China Sea, our commitments to allies and to Taiwan. Commitments to allies are not destroyed by enemy action. They are destroyed by failure to carry out the commitment. And so that's extremely important. And secondly, that capacity to carry out the commitment is basically very much reinforced by our capacity to engage the other side in the area concerned. And that's why we have a large fleet in the Pacific and land-based forces in Korea and Japan, in Okinawa, in Guam, now in the Philippines and in other places. So that's important. The second point is that the real danger of intermediate range nuclear missiles is the one I averted to a while ago, that the 6 to 7 minute flight time. Well, China has no basis other than perhaps 2 submarines, and they carry strategic missiles of getting within 6 to 7 minutes flight time of the United States. So in effect, that kind of rearmament or armament of China has to do with the regional problem, which I've just addressed, and not the US homeland problem. And it is unlikely to have that for any foreseeable time in the future. In the meantime, there should be no objection, in my view, to Russia and the United States going to China and saying, look, these missiles, this intermediate range missiles, doesn't give you anything more than your strategic missiles give. And we think it's a mistake for you to produce them. And would you join the treaty with us? We think it will be helpful to you and helpful to us, because an armaments race with the Russians and the US is not going to be one you're going to win.
want to stay with China. There was a kind of a think piece that I saw recently. It's a little bit of a complicated argument. We'll lay out for the audience and have you respond. The argument is that Chinese nuclear forces, unlike both Russian and American nuclear forces, Chinese nuclear forces have been deliberately interspersed among their conventional forces. And that if, therefore, there were ever a conflict, for example, over Taiwan, in which the United States launched conventional attacks against the Chinese military, we would, without intending to directly, we would run the risk of having engaged in a first strike against their nuclear capabilities. That therefore, the Chinese have put themselves by this doctrine, have put themselves in a situation where they may feel they have to use it rather than lose it. Is this a problem that you're familiar with, one that you think is real? And is there a way for us to begin conversations with the Chinese about the issue of their nuclear doctrine in the kind of way that we did so for such a long period of time with the Soviet Union?
I think it's not a trivial question, but you have to know it is still a regional, not an existential U.S. problem. China's posture with respect to nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles has always been quite minimalist. As I think I may have said, maybe not here this afternoon right now, but to a number of times today, that the Chinese posture is to have a very significantly limited number of strategically deliverable nuclear weapons to take out one major U.S. city as a sufficient deterrent. And in fact, Kim Jong-un may be also persuaded that that's a way to proceed. The Chinese know and understand, however, that would bring a full-scale retaliation against them. And while Chairman Mao has said that he's prepared to lose 300 million people in a nuclear exchange, he would still emerge with more people than the United States, may or may not be true today, given the power of nuclear weapons. Anything which, in a sense, engages nuclear prematurely or engages nuclear in a way that forces use is a mistake. And clearly, one would want to avoid that. Happily, I think we know where Chinese nuclear-capable missiles are stored and where they deploy. We can, as a result of having highly accurate missiles, be able to avoid that. So I think that that's the first practical approach to this. The second practical approach is to talk to them about it. But it is something of concern because we are now converting some of our long-range missiles to conventional capability, given the high accuracy we can achieve. And the Russians are looking at this and saying to us, if that's the case, you are going to, in fact, launch against our nuclear deterrent or our command centers or our communications construction or whatever we have to try to take us out with conventional missiles without hazarding a nuclear response. And that's the reason why they have said they want to change their first use policy to comprehend those kinds of things. All of that is difficult. I think that there are limitations on both sides of of long-range delivery of conventional weapons that we ought to take a look at to provide the degree that neither side can endanger the other to the point where it would be motivated to take on a nuclear strike. And that's important. And so both of these are subjects not yet anywhere near the negotiating table that I think we should look at. And clearly those arguments are ones that have to be contended with.
Okay, so let's go to our run. Where we were at the negotiating table and achieved an agreement, which the president has withdrawn from. You both have followed this from the beginning in great detail and know this was a heated political argument in the United States under the Obama administration. Many Democratic senators toyed with voting against the agreement, put out statements of reservation about the agreement. Now we have withdrawn from it. Does the withdrawal, in your view, make the United States and its allies less safe? If so, why?
So, the Iran deal, the nuclear deal, actually is still alive. It's on life support, but since our withdrawal, it is unfortunately could be dying a slow death. But let's be clear, our allies are still committed to it. The Russians, Chinese, and virtually the rest of the world is committed to it. And most importantly, the Iranians are still committed to it. They're still fulfilling their commitments to the deal, which, by the way, has dramatically reduced their uranium enrichment stockpile. Also blocked any path to a plutonium-based bomb. Extended the breakout time, that's the time it would take for them to build a bomb, from just 60 days to about a year. And more importantly, it's put in place the most extensive inspection and monitoring regime we've ever seen. So there are personnel, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency on the ground in Iran 24/7 now. And then the other thing that I don't think gets enough attention is Iran is a party to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, unlike North Korea. And that treaty forbids them from ever acquiring nuclear weapons, and they never have. So to answer your question, and remember when President Trump withdrew, the reason he withdrew, he said, well, because it was, I think, the worst deal ever negotiated. But secondly, he said he would negotiate a better deal. And we haven't seen that now. We haven't seen any attempt to renegotiate. In fact, we see it ratcheting up of tension between Tehran and Washington. Now, what have we accomplished by withdrawing from the deal? I think we have now encountered a number of developments that directly undermine our own national security. So first and foremost, we stand virtually alone, and we are isolated. As I mentioned, our major allies are sticking with the deal. They're trying to save it. Other world powers who negotiated are sticking with it. So there are just about a handful of countries now that are opposed to it. Israel, UAE, Saudis, and Bahrain. I think those are the only countries that are with us on this. So make no mistake about it, we're standing virtually alone. Secondly, we have, with this action, really damaged our relationships with our closest allies and the transatlantic alliance. So keep in mind, before we got involved in the nuclear negotiations, the Europeans had been at it for about a decade. So they have invested a lot of time and political capital into bringing this deal about. They're invested in it. It's not just for economic gain for them. They see it as a plus for their national security. If you look at their proximity to the Middle East, if we had a nuclear Iran, that would probably lead to a war and bring more refugees into Europe's midst. So they see this as a direct threat to their national security. We have now reimposed sanctions on Iran. So any European business that does business with the Iranians will be penalized. So essentially what we've said to our closest allies is, even though Iran is fulfilling its commitments to the deal, a deal that you made with them, we will not allow you to fulfill your commitments to that deal. And that's a very unusual situation to put our closest allies in. Another element that I think has really impacted us negatively and gets very little attention is the risk we are now putting on the primacy of the dollar in the global financial system. So as a result of these sanctions, we now see the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians actively working to find workarounds to the dollar to do business with Iran. The Europeans will be announcing, I think almost any day now, what's called a special purpose vehicle to do legitimate trade with the Iranians. And the Russians and Chinese are pursuing similar projects. And what this does is, in the global financial system where the dollar is king, we are undermining that position by, some would say, forcing these other countries to find payment systems that are now not pegged to the dollar. That's bad for us over the long term. And then the other area where I think we're undermining ourselves, we talked about North Korea earlier. This deal that is working with Iran, we have reneged on it. What kind of message do you think that sends to the North Koreans as we try to pursue a nuclear deal with them? And I've said this before, when I think of the innovation of the nuclear deal, the one that stands out to me most is this inspection system that it's put in place. If we had a system like that on the ground in North Korea now, maybe 10% of that inspection regime, that would be a good deal. So I think the idea that the North Koreans aren't paying close attention to this, that the United States made a deal, the Iranians actually poured concrete into their plutonium facility in a city called Iraq. That's not necessarily irreversible, but it's pretty close. Why would the North Koreans do anything to set back their program, especially in terms of irreversibility, when they see the next president could just pull us out? So it sets a very dangerous precedent. And then finally, in my own personal experience, I've had the opportunity to travel to Iran and other parts of the region too. And this is purely anecdotal, but I've shared notes with many others who have traveled to Iran. I know you have too, Tom. And what's striking about it is how pro-American the Iranian people are. The regime itself, not so much. But the people of Iran, I mean, I've traveled quite extensively in the world, and Tom, I think, has probably been to every country. But I've never come across a more friendly group of people towards Americans. And I think now what we're doing is that pro-American perspective on the part of the people of Iran, and I'm talking about the major cities, we are undermining that by reimposing these sanctions to a deal their government is fulfilling. What message does that send to the people of Iran? We talk about winning the hearts and minds of people in the Middle East. We do that through various methods. We already have a society of 80 million people, educated, sophisticated, already thinking positively about that. Why are we doing this to undercut that sentiment when it is so, when it's absent in the region? There are many other negatives, but I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Suzanne, and I think that was a tremendous exposition of the downsides. I always ask myself, what were the upsides? The president took an oath to the Constitution. That involves the president in defending U.S. national interests. Could the denunciation and the violation, and it was a violation of the deal, of the U.S. getting out, support American national interests in any way? It's hard for me to see that. And in fact, it's quite the other way around. As Suzanne pointed out, the denunciation or the violation of the agreement opens the way for Iran to leave anytime it wishes with no obligation. We made the agreement with no way of getting out of it to keep Iran in, as we were afraid Iran might try to get out of the deal partway through. It turned out that we were the problem, not the Iranians. So I think that that's extremely important. And I haven't yet found any reason for us to denounce the deal. I think behind all of this was ABO, anything but Obama, which is not a reason that supports U.S. national interests in getting out an agreement which on itself certainly pushed back for a long period of time Iranian capacity to become a nuclear weapon power. And that was, I think, agreed. The president talked about the idea that ballistic missiles had to be included. And we would all like to have seen this, but Iran, for its own reasons, and the United States, for its own reasons, decided not to include ballistic missiles. The U.S., because we could get stronger verification and stronger limits if we didn't have to dilute them and bring ballistic missiles in. And we believed that stopping Iran from getting a nuclear warhead meant that ballistic missiles, while they had conventional capability, were not going to be the kind of danger. Finally, you could say, well, Israel wanted us to do it. And the answer, of course, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted us to do it, followed by some in his party. But having spent a good amount of my life in Israel as ambassador, it was very clear to me that over 200 general officers of both Israeli intelligence and military forces had taken the view that the agreement was very much in Israel's interest, despite its limited time limits, and that therefore there was a difference in Israel of significant proportions about whether in fact this was really doing Israel a service. So in the end, I think that we are in a mercurial and uncertain way making things so much worse that the Russians, who have always wanted to drive wedges between the United States and the Europeans, now have a perfect wedge in place that they can drive home. We are actually sanctioning our friends, as Suzanne said, for not carrying out their obligations under a treaty which we helped to design and put in place.
It's a treaty, by the way, that's been endorsed by a United Nations Security Council resolution. And to me, that is important. But I think it's important to address another aspect. Tom brought up missiles. And also I would include Iran's what we call malign behavior in the region. So there's no doubt the Iranians are undertaking activities that actively undermine U.S. interests and the interests of our allies and the partners in the region. But I would contend, what's the best way to move forward on that? Since we reneged from the deal, we now have no official channel with the Iranians. So there's no government-to-government channel in existence. That to me is bad, because how do we negotiate? But more than that, what if there is a miscalculation on one of our parts? I remember the time when, during the Obama administration, a U.S. naval vessel inadvertently strayed into Iranian waters in the Persian Gulf. And because we had an existing channel with the Iranians at that time, in fact, our Secretary of State had the cell phone number of the Iranian foreign minister, and what could have escalated into an all-out conflict was resolved within hours. We don't have that anymore. And when we think about the turmoil in the region, us increasingly bumping up against the Iranians, whether it's in the Persian Gulf or in Iraq or in Syria and so forth, that does worry me. And I think to deal with the broader issues, the Iranian support of Hezbollah, for example, their support of the Houthis in Yemen, their support of Shia militia in Iraq, these are real issues. And I think by far a more sensible approach would be stick with the deal, stick with our obligations as long as the Iranians are, build on that deal to construct and engage in dialogue on missiles and also their activities in the region. Because right now, none of that is happening. We've really closed the door to any diplomatic engagement on the range of issues I've just discussed. I would also add Afghanistan to that list. Right now, we're trying to undertake peace talks with the various groups in Afghanistan, including the Taliban. And here is a situation where we actually have a precedent where the Iranians helped bring about a peace agreement following 9/11 with the Afghans. This is another issue we should be talking to the Iranians about because they have influence there. Afghanistan is a neighbor. So I think the deal itself, backing out of it, yes, we've now opened the door to the possibility of the Iranians withdrawing from the deal themselves and pursuing a nuclear, or ratcheting up their nuclear activity, which would cause a crisis. But we're also missing the opportunity to engage them in this other set of issues. And finally, if the Iranians were to decide one day soon, that they are out of the deal, they're not getting the benefits, why should they live by this deal? They start enriching uranium at whatever percent, start going down the road of what looks like a weaponization project. What do we think the Saudis would do? Very likely they would probably want the same technology. In fact, we're in the process of negotiating with the Saudis on a civil nuclear deal, and the sticking point is they don't want any binding agreement that prevents them from enriching uranium. So this is a much broader issue, and I've tried to lay out, I hope I didn't go too far astray, but just by reneging on this deal, I think we've really shut the door to diplomacy on this whole range of issues.
Okay, one last question from me, and then we'll turn to the audience. I want to play devil's advocate a little bit with what you've so clearly stated with regard to the Iran deal. Suzanne, you said the only countries really that are with Trump on this are Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE. So one could say, well, those are the countries that are on the front line. Those are the countries that feel they have the most to risk, the most at risk, if the Iranians pursue nuclear weapons. They don't feel that this deal protects them. Why are they wrong?
I will tell you they're wrong because in addition to those three others, Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman are all members of the same group, and they have been supportive of the deal and believe it does protect them. And I think that the widespread analysis all around the world of people who are experts in this kind of question has in every way been totally in favor of the deal accomplishing what it is set out to do, as long as the Iranians comply. And we are the ones who have broken up the deal and opened the door for the Iranians to do anything they want. Why would that be in the interest of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE, that previously the Iranians were tightly restricted? And now, because of actions of the US, their best ally, they are totally unrestricted if they choose to be. They haven't chosen to be yet, but they could choose to be. I think Suzanne and I have given you plenty of reasons why it's not a good idea to have done this and why it's not a good idea to try to continue with it. And the fact is that our friends and allies are carrying the ball in keeping the deal alive for the moment, but we are sanctioning them for doing that, which seems to be a kind of double strike on our friends here, who are in many ways as much concerned about nuclear proliferation as anybody, because they're closer to where it might be taking place and have less capacity to defend themselves through, in fact, mutually assured destruction in terms of anything the Iranians might do.
Thank you both. Okay, we're gonna open it up. Haley has the microphone to find folks. Coming up to the front row.
We can get along with one because only one of us can speak at a time.
Thank you. Actually, Master Buchanan took the words out of my mouth. You pointed out that most of the emphasis people have on ballistic missile land waste, but when you said that we also have to consider that we have submarines We have other sea delivery systems, particularly with the Russians and the Chinese, and to a certain extent, the Indians trying to develop their submarine capabilities. Look, I would just say let's not focus on land-based, because if you have overhead, if you have intelligence, you can see preparation, you can see bases, but you can't see submarines. The other thing I should probably mention, I don't think we have enough time, Pakistan and India, that tension seems to have gone down. Thank you.
I spent some of my time in India, and I think that it's gone down only because other issues and questions have dominated the news, and that the problem between India and Pakistan remains as fierce as it ever has, maybe even becoming more fierce over the move in the direction of a peace negotiation in Afghanistan, where Pakistan is deeply worried that India's strong support for Afghanistan is a way of moving in strategically behind Pakistan, and that the Indians are deeply worried because the Pakistanis are worried, and that in itself has for many years caused us to be deeply concerned that since they are both nuclear armed, and while we have sought to try to find help to them to get that nuclear armament under stricter control, it is still a flashpoint. And that was not my punctuation, I apologize. But if we woke up anybody, maybe it did some good. But in any event, that's a flashpoint that we have to be very worried about. And I don't think we pay enough attention to that issue. I'm convinced there is a solution to their problem, but I'm also convinced that we are so preoccupied with so many other things that the role that we can constructively play, which is a quiet one behind the scenes, is something we're not prepared to undertake for reasons of overwork rather than the lack of interest. Thank you.
Thank you. For those of us who are not as well scripted as you are in nuclear weapons and countries, is there a site under the United Nations or somewhere that lists all of the countries that have nuclear weapons and the types of weapons so that you could actually track from 1980 to 90 to 2000, et cetera, where we are and where we're going? Thank you.
Yeah, there are many that do. The five nuclear powers, China, Britain, France, the United States, and Russia, are recognized in a treaty that, in effect, commits all the other members never to make nuclear weapons. 3 states are not members of the treaty: Israel, Pakistan, and India. Pakistan and India are known to have tested. Some suspect Israel might have tested, but Israel's view is that it doesn't disclose what its position is with respect to nuclear weapons capability. But I think for anybody who follows the Middle East, it would be a strange animal who would tell you Israel is not a nuclear power. Beyond that, the question of how many weapons is something that various groups around the world, something called the International Institute of Strategic Studies, produces an annual which lists armed forces and what's known about capabilities. And it's usually an estimate of ranges, 50 to 70, 200 to 300, that will give you the information that we know or have reason to believe is correct. And often those kinds of documents are prepared in consultation with one or a number of governments, so they reflect more than just casual press sources.
On this point, I would highly recommend an organization called the Arms Control Association, which is based in Washington. It's a membership organization. I'm a card-carrying member. And if you go to their website, what's nice about it is it also includes information of every arms control, nuclear, chemical, biological, weapons treaty agreement from the past, currently in force, status of that force. It's really a one-stop shop, and they also published a monthly publication on key issues that are topical and timely to the day. So I highly recommend that.
We talked about this just a little bit, but do you believe, based on the fact that you know a lot of these folks and you've spoken with them and you interact with them on, say, a regular basis, do you believe today that there are enough world leaders or influential folks who appreciate the concept of mutually assured destruction to the depth that Gorbachev and Reagan did? Or are we in free flow?
To the extent that something like 190 plus countries have signed the agreement not to make nuclear weapons, it's a little hard to believe that they don't understand the fact that they are giving up the possibility of making nuclear weapons is important. I think that not all of them, but some of them, certainly the NATO membership, understands the importance of mutually assured destruction because they are part of the US nuclear defense umbrella in which mutually assured destruction plays the role of defending them as well as the United States, and that's our commitment. So I think that it sticks out there as a way to go. There is no certainty that from time to time, some country might come along and say, we want to change our policy. And indeed, after having done a lot of work on its nuclear weapons program, North Korea took itself out of the treaty. The treaty has several deals. One of the deals is if you sign up not to be a nuclear weapon power, then you can get nuclear assistance from all the other countries to be a civil nuclear power and make medicines and make material to power your electrical grid and so on. Having gotten all of that from the Russians in the main, and maybe some from the Chinese, there was always a concern that North Korea pulling out, in a sense, took all the cake and ate it, but had it still. And so they, in effect, used the treaty as a stepping stone to exactly what the treaty was designed to prohibit. And there's a concern about that. There's concern that while India was not in the treaty, it got nuclear assistance as if it were, and used that nuclear assistance, including from Canada and the United States, to develop its own nuclear weapons program. Pakistan from France and China. And Israel, we believe, from France originally, got assistance in a way that supported the development of nuclear programs in those countries.
To answer the question briefly, I think when you look, I'll go back to the Iran nuclear deal. When you look at the major parties to the deal, the UK, France, Germany, Russians, and Chinese, I think they are committed to recognize mutually assured destruction. And I'm more concerned, frankly, and I don't mean this in a partisan way, of how our own president looks at nuclear weapons. What I shared before, what he reportedly said. Also, as when I think of, someone asked me what is our current policy on nuclear weapons, whether you're an expert or not, I think you'd be very hard pressed to come up with an answer. What exactly is our policy? There doesn't seem to be a real strategy in place. There's clearly a desire to have more nuclear weapons, more powerful nuclear weapons, also smaller nuclear weapons, which I think is very frightening. Why do you need smaller nuclear weapons if you're never going to use them? It makes them more usable. The administration is interested in pursuing that. So I think my biggest worry when I look at the world stage in terms of leadership is how the United States' voice on these matters has changed, and also our national security advisor being so opposed to treaties that, frankly, I think advance our interests.
Perhaps I could just add one more thing. I think that understanding mutually assured destruction is important, but also understanding the fact that a lot of experts can tell you through which kind of accident, which kind of miscalculation, which kinds of misjudgments you might well enter into a nuclear exchange, but there is nobody who can tell you conclusively, once it begins, how you stop it.
And one final point, I'm sorry. I'm surprised how many people don't know this, but the decision to launch a nuclear weapon rests on the shoulders of one person, and that's the president.
So for those of us who care about these issues, and I think everybody here does, what are next steps that we might take to influence the signing of a UN treaty, influence no first strike bills, laws, influence a reduction in nuclear weapons?
I answered that question today in an earlier discussion in a way that I hope will give you a sense of my deep frustration. I come from New Jersey, and I follow the old Jersey City admonition, vote early and often.
If I could just add a little, I'd like to attach myself. I'm also from New Jersey, by the way. So I want to attach myself to that advice. But I think now, in terms of our Congress, there's a little bit of a different dynamic. I think we'll probably see a little more oversight on these issues, I hope, and hopefully more hearings. I think we need to bring in experts before our Congress and Senate to talk about things like withdrawing from the INF, what we're going to spend on nuclear weapons going forward, how we're going to maintain and build on our current systems. These are hearings and debates that frankly have been missing the last couple of years. So that's one thing. Is it may sound cliche, but talk to your congressmen, senators about these issues. And then there are a number of very excellent organizations that are very concerned with these issues. I mentioned one, Arms Control Association, that are really active on the Hill with the executive branch and others. The other is Plowshares Fund, which is located in both Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. There's the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is located in Washington as well. There is I think it's called ICAN, I-C-A-N. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's led by the woman who won, or the group that won the Nobel Prize, yes. And they are really working towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons, which now, of course, seems like a pipe dream, but I think it is a worthy goal to stick with and make sure that is our position eventually. So there are organizations like that as well. I think maybe has come across in our comments, but we're very concerned about the current state of nuclear affairs, particularly our own U.S. voice on the stage. I don't think it's loud enough, strong enough to take on these issues. I think we abdicated a bit of our leadership role, if I could put it mildly, I think. So we have to fill the void.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so I want to do a kind of a lightning round. I see 3 hands, and I see more than that, but we only have time for 3. So Haley, if you could sort of pass the mic, let's get all 3 questions, and then I'm going to ask for short answers, and we'll go from there.
I want to leave China and nukes and go back to your friend Kim. Both of you have said that we have some leverage because Kim is interested in economic development. And I wonder why you think China is in a much better place for them. They have a much better track record in the last 35 years. And we have no good track record of exporting economic development. So you're big on our leverage there. I wonder how much leverage we have.
As we look out to the later decades of the 21st century, what is your assessment, either one of you or both, of space-based nuclear weapons and where we may have potential to prevent that from happening?
My question is, could the Singapore summit have occurred without all the preliminary saber rattling? Did that saber rattling encourage China to encourage Kim to engage?
In any order.
On the first one, on Kim Jong-un, is China a better economic partner? There's no question about it. I put the Russians in this boat as well. And also, in terms of a model, Singapore is a good model. Vietnam is a very good model for them. We are not a model for them. We're probably Kim Jong-un's biggest nightmare. But that is not, I think the point is where our leverage comes is China, Kim Jong-un personally and his regime are the most sanctioned regime on earth. Maybe Iran is, maybe they're neck and neck. But in order for them to, for example, they want to restart an economic project with the South Koreans, which I didn't mention, also a good partner. But in order to do that, an economic project called Kaesong, which is was up and running at some point, they need to get sanctions relief from the United States, from the UN Security Council. So that's where we come in, and that's where we have the leverage. The other point on the North Korean-China relationship, it isn't as close as a lot of people think. And I do not think the North Koreans, in my discussions with them, necessarily want to be reliant on the Chinese. In fact, I think they don't want to be. So that would be another point of leverage that we have. But in terms of this third question, I think saber rattling, without it, could we have gotten to the Singapore summit? There's no question in my mind we could have, and we should have. I think it was very reckless to bring us to the brink like that. I think there were plans drawn up for military strikes against the North Koreans. There was also talk of requiring our American citizens to leave South Korea, which would send a signal to Kim Jong-un that an attack was imminent and may have caused him to strike first or do something very stupid. It was a dangerous period, and I think we took some risks, unnecessary risks. I liken it to, when I think of Trump and his approach to these things, he likes to be the person who starts the fire. What's that word? Yes, exactly. But then once he starts this blaze, he wants to come in and be the firefighter, right? So that's what I see happening. I see it happening. It happened in North Korea, to some extent in Syria, but there are other examples as well. So I think the North Koreans were ready to engage for a simple reason, and that was because they felt like they completed their nuclear program. They managed to get a thermonuclear device, which I think our experts think is 250 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. Imagine that. And also these ICBMs, the capacity to deliver it to the United States. That's what brought, by and large, the North Koreans to the table, was that capacity. Yes, sanctions played a role, but it wasn't the decisive factor in my estimation. And on the space-based nuclear weapons, I certainly don't have expertise in this area, but based on what I've read, I'm not convinced that they're even within the realm of technical possibility at this point. And in terms of costs, I'm not sure they're a good bet for us. Someone would open up. So I would need to learn more about them, but I'm not convinced.
Let me try to go fairly quickly. Agree generally with Suzanne. I think China and Korea have had long-term enmities. China is very worried about collapse of North Korea, and that's important because the Chinese believe that on the one hand, it might push people across the border. On the other hand, it might invite others to play in the space. and create more dangers for them. At the same time, the Chinese clearly are the big brothers and want to control North Korea. It's the buffer zone that keeps American and South Korean forces away from their frontier on the Yalu River. And this is important. Finally, I think the Koreans see us as the primary threat to them as a result of the unsolved outcome of the Korean War. And we can bring them, they pretend to believe at least, the peace that they think they need in order to have some certainty that they will not be under continued threat by the United States. And the United States over the years has acted as if North Korea is a serious danger. After all, we've had a number of dust-ups, including with the Pueblo. So these are all things that they see as the heart of enmity. And so we are an important player. I think we're an important player too in the eyes of the North Koreans because of economic capacity. And I think we have spent lots of money in lots of places around the world, but we have some successes to look at as well. And I think South Korea is one of those. So that's there. Space-based weapons are a real possibility. We had nuclear tests in space. So in fact, the space-based weapon is not a technical problem for us. We agreed that for everybody's sake, it was a good idea not to have them because they would be almost instantaneous retaliation weapons and could in one way or another interrupt but not destroy mutually assured destruction. But they would in many ways rain havoc, radioactive havoc around the Earth if we were not careful about how they were used. And so they had this enormous destructive power that people didn't feel was necessary. But we're looking at that now, unfortunately, and there are people around the United States who will advocate almost anything. And there are some who advocate space-based weapons. And we need to be careful that the new, rather large expenditure on nuclear weapons doesn't take us there, certainly without any significant reasons. On Singapore, I agree fully that it was, saber rattling that got us there. But it was saber rattling blended with the notion that we had to start a process of contact, communication, high-level meetings, and even diplomacy. We failed very badly on the diplomacy side, but the other pieces have put us in a position so far to continue to move in that direction. And I think if you go away tonight with any theme on North Korea, it's that diplomacy needs to play the kind of constructive role that we all have envisaged it might play in moving this question away from fire, fury, instant threat, massive retaliation, and all the other things that one way or another are out there. And that over the years we have seen the North Koreans gradually become comfortable with a kind of passive U.S. response. A violent U.S. response, in my view, moves them off the dime, just as the possibility of a high-level presidential meeting moved them off the dime. The really interesting question is, can we make it work for us?
Thank you. I want to thank you both. These issues are simultaneously laboriously technical and yet terrible and philosophical, all at the same time. You've managed to elucidate them for us very clearly. Thank you both. Thank our audience for